Hamer back with another Mission Impossible episode review. I just finished watching, and I'm now going to review The Revival, Season 1, Episode 15, which is called The Devils. So, this one starts with a group of men in black robes chanting evilly and leading a drugged, white-robed girl to an altar where a goat lord-looking figure stands. He pours some blood on her, grabs a very scary-looking knife, and stabs her. One of the men, Russell, whose faces we see in the scene, wakes up screaming from the nightmarish scene. Jim gets his instructions using spy speak with a guy on a shrimp trawler. The man we saw, Russell, is an American diplomat who's now been committed to a sanitarium. Two other diplomats like him have committed suicide, and the link is that all three of them were recently guests of British House of Lords member John Holman, who is believed to have somehow caused all of this mayhem. The mission is to determine whether or not Holman is guilty, and if so, have him brought to justice. So, in the apartment scene, we're told that the bodies of three young women have been found not far from Cobden Manor, which is Holman's estate. There will be a druidic celebration of the summer solstice next week, as the manor was built on old druid land, and I really don't like the way this is going. Anyway, off we go to the UK facility where the now insane Russell is being kept. Grant gives him a hypnogenic drug and uses a device to analyze his brainwaves or something. He gets him to think about the manor and Lord Holman. And apparently the poor guy has a vision of what we saw before. Jim realizes his trauma is due to being involved in those satanic rites. The IMF sets up in a tent on the manor grounds with Grant giving Jim and Max some special gear and Nicholas and Shannon getting set up as gypsies participating in the druidic festivities. Grant takes the role of an American detective assigned to the case, butting heads with the local constable about his seemingly cavalier attitude towards the non-American girls who were killed. Holman tells the celebrants to not hunt or otherwise mess with his property, and his man Kellis is wary of the gypsy tent pulling up, giving them the same warning. Shannon offers to tell his future, indicating that there is great evil coming. A limousine drives by with Jim looking out the window, and Shannon actually refers to him as, it's hard to tell, either the master or Satan, frightening the superstitious Kellis away. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble keeping myself together for this. I apologize. Back at the manor near the altar area, Holman shows a hesitant fellow named Dunstan his latest sedated victim, a girl named Lucy, and says Dunstan will be initiated into their cult or whatever later that night. Kellis tells Holman he has visitors, who turn out to be Jim and his silent assistant, Max. Thanks to Grant's gadgetry, they have fiery eyes, taking Holman aback for a moment, but he regains his composure and figures it's just contact lenses, which is actually true. Grant sneaks into the manor's basement to mess with the lights at appropriate junctures when Max signals. And Jim is able to name many of the people Holman has involved in the ceremonies that he, as the Dark Lord, enjoys so much, but tells Holman that now comes the time to pay for using the mighty Dark Lord's name. Holman still scoffs and figures it's a blackmail scheme, but Jim is able to manipulate the lights, and thanks to some special hoof-like footprints, which spray a weird gas, Holman sort of sees Jim and Max disappear into thin air. Despite this, he continues things as planned with his guests as well as poor Lucy. Nicholas and Shannon discover a gazebo with some wiring as well as an underground stream running through it, and Grant releases some dye into it to track its path. One guess, no prizes where it leads. That night, the IMF, minus Jim for whatever reason, head down into the gazebo tunnel and find the altar room, where Dunstan is being initiated into the cult. When the throng leaves, the IMF enters a room and sees Grant's dye going through it, getting a decent look around. The next day, Grant shows the constable the dye in the water where the bodies were found and tells him about Holman's makeshift temple, as well as the fact that he is fairly sure there will be another body during an upcoming ceremony for the summer solstice. Grant and Nicholas break into the manor house and into Holman's office, gaslighting the room with some devices, including a bug. The constable calls Holman about it, and Holman tells him to set up an accident for Grant. But the constable decides to take a pistol from his drawer, which also contains a pentagram, and shoots himself. Kellis and Holman later discuss the constable's suicide and the fact that Shannon referred to Jim as the master, which Jim overhears. Shannon heads towards the house and pretends to tell the cook's fortune, spotting Kellis getting some food for Lucy and alerting Max, who follows him in and rescues her when Kellis leaves, taking her to the IMF tent where Nicholas is putting on a Holman mask. Holman discovers that Lucy's gone and orders Kellis to find her or someone else to take his place, else it'll be him, before their planned midnight ceremony. Grant sets up some equipment at the altar, and Holman finds that Jim and Max have quietly appeared in his office. Holman seems more convinced that Jim is actually the Dark Lord and asks whether Jim is after his soul. Jim says he already has it, showing him Nicholas's Holman outside his window, who disappears in a fiery poof as Max gives an evil cackle. Outside, for some ridiculous reason, Shannon watches Nicholas leave the scene. Kellis comes up behind her, knocking her out. Holman says he had a sacrifice for the Dark Lord, but he lost it. Jim tells him to get moving as he expects one for the ceremony tonight, as Kellis downstairs brings a groggy Shannon down to the cell. The IMF reconvene at the tent, with Nicholas wanting to rescue Shannon right away, but Jim says he has a better idea. Holman muses to Kellis about whether he might get his soul back if the Dark Lord is happy with the sacrifice, as some of the others undress and prepare Shannon for the ceremony, for which it is time, and the drugged Shannon is laid on the altar. Max and Nicholas knock out some of the participants and take their places. Goat Lord Holman appears and is ready to stab her, but then sees Max with his fiery eyes and Nicholas as himself, still wearing the mask, while Grant lights up some of the kerosene he planted in the ceremonial pool. Everybody's freaked out. Jim appears, spooking the others away, advancing on Holman and telling him it's too late to save his soul. Holman steps backwards to keep away and ends up falling into the fiery pool. Holman is later fished out of the water as the others were, with the IMF looking on and then driving away. Mission accomplished. Okay, you've probably guessed just from my facial expressions and the tone of my voice as I was recapping this episode what I'm going to say for the purposes of the discussion here. This episode gets an absolute unqualified F. If I could give it a lower grade, I would do so. I would probably hate this one regardless, just because of the nature of it and the Satanism and all of that kind of stuff, which is very disturbing to me on a personal level. That's just me. But that's almost an afterthought. It has so much else bad going for it that, you know, the theme of it is almost an afterthought. I have no idea who thought this was a good idea. It bothers me a little bit in thinking about this to think that, you know what, they actually went ahead with this. Peter Graves could have pulled rank, at least I would have liked to think. I'd like to think so, and say, no, this script is terrible, and I won't do it. I mean, maybe he did, and who knows what happened. Maybe it was worse, and this is actually a better take. Who knows? Anyway, moving on. I still remember the last time the IMF went to the British countryside. As much as it pains me to do so, I'm going to take some of that back. I had honestly forgotten how absolutely wretched this episode is. Compared to this, Lover's Knot, I won't say it would, compared to this, Lover's Knot doesn't belong, like, say, in the top 10 of the original episodes, but it certainly would go to the top half. That's how bad this is. Let's just start it off point by point. Objectively, my personal feelings aside, here's why this episode is terrible. First point, like the episode we had a few ago called The Haunting, the mission is so vague and silly about why the IMF is even involved. It sounds like one of those missions, and we had some of these in the original series, later in the series, where it seemed like, and I mentioned this before in some of the reviews, where it seems like the writers did a story, and then they're like, oh yeah, we have to make it into a mission. So they actually, kind of set up the mission as it's described on tape to just be very vague and just describe what the crux of the story that they wrote is. Rather than it being the other way around, where there's like a well thought out and well crafted mission, and then they create a story of how that mission gets fulfilled. This is backwards in that sense, and definitely feels like that. Now, just because there's an American diplomat involved and an American tourist who got killed, now suddenly the IMF has to get involved and they're supposed to care. I don't know. That's bothersome to me and not good. Next, let's talk about what actually happens in the episode. A device that can use brainwaves to create images on a computer from people's thoughts or their dreams. Are you kidding me? The writers had absolutely no clue how to establish any kind of sensible way for the IMF to be on track, shall we say, to figure out that, okay, this is what we're going to have to do because this is what's going on. We're dealing with a guy who's putting people through satanic rites, so now we'll have to formulate a plan based on that. Not through any kind of investigating, not through any kind of detective work. Not that that would have been a whole heck of a lot more better or entertaining, I don't think. But the idea that such a device could exist and do things in the way that we are shown is just so preposterous and ridiculous. Not to mention that just by going through it, let's even be very gracious and say that, okay, such a device could exist. Basically, crime number one, they basically driven a poor guy even more insane than he already was. I don't know if that's a crime, but it should be, frankly. Moving on. There is just so much boneheaded and ridiculous dialogue in this one. The scene at the gazebo where, Nicholas and Shannon are talking to each other, and he's kind of basically ignoring her and saying stupid stuff on her own, making her dialogue look even more stupid. That's just probably the best example of that in this episode, but all around, you'd be very hard-pressed to find non-banal dialogue in this episode, as far as I'm concerned. Moving forward. Next crime, in the sense, committed by the IMF. Finally, the IMF manages to rescue Lucy because of the blatant incompetence of the villains here. Nick putting on the Holman mask in front of Lucy, who just got rescued and taken away from this guy who was going to kill her. What the hell, IMF? Inflicting intentional trauma on this poor girl who you're trying to help? Seriously? Who does that? I wish that was the worst of it. Then Shannon, for reasons which make absolutely no sense, goes out and uses binoculars to make sure that Nicholas's part of, impersonating Holman goes okay. And even there's some stupid dialogue. Oh, wow. Gee, that was really great, Nicholas. And then suddenly Kellis, is able to knock her out and take her away. Worse than that, Jim realizes what must have happened. Nicholas says, well, we've got to go rescue her. And Jim is like, no, I have a better idea. And then what we see is we see a couple of the guys, Dunstan and one of the other cult members, basically undressing, molesting I can't think of a better word, molesting Shannon. Jim allows this to happen for the sake of the mission. What in the blue hell, IMF? Seriously, if I was Shannon and after all this is done and I found out that happened, and Jim is like, well, you knew the risks, Shannon. We had to complete the mission. What? Everything that happens in this episode is so brutally contrived. But this is just like, I just don't even know what to think about this. It's not just stupid. It's absolutely ridiculous. There was a part that I missed. I just actually remembered. When the night of the initiation ceremony, the 4 junior team members, all of them other than Jim, go down to the temple area. They look around a little bit after the initiation ceremony is done, and then they just leave, with Grant noticing a couple of things. Why did it need all of them? Why do they all have to go down there? Doesn't make any sense. Or if they were actually to go down there, we see from later on what happens in the episode that the cell where Lucy is being held is right around the corner. They could have taken some time and they could have, investigated the place, but they don't bother, right? I don't know what's going on here. I really don't. Nothing that goes on here makes any kind of sense. And then to top it all off, we get the Disney villain death of the villain here, because of course we do, right? He has to fall into his own pool of fire and die a fiery death, and he's being sent to the hell that he deserves. Okay, all right, whatever. Sure, whatever you say. By that time, I can't pinpoint exactly the time, but there came a point where I just said to myself, I just want this to be done. Please get me out of this. This is not even an I don't care about these people situation. This, to me, is more of an I am upset that such people could exist, even if it is on a TV show or in somebody's imagination. This, I don't know, this is this kind of stuff of nightmares for me. And again, it's made worse by the fact that nothing about it makes any sense. We have that brief moment in the middle where Holman is talking to the constable, and the constable kills himself because Holman orders him to kill this American detective, who's Grant, obviously. But the constable says, no, I'm not going to be a part of this anymore. And pulls out a pistol, and it's implied, obviously, because he's got a pentagram there, that he was also involved at some level with Holman and kind of knew about some of this all along. I guess he was okay just being kind of part of the satanic rites, and he felt bad, and he told himself, well, I'm not the one who's holding the knife and stabbing these girls, so it's okay. And then, of course, nothing really becomes of that. This is, again, I'm going to go with the only analogy that I can really think of. I know some people may get tired of it, but going to something like professional wrestling, or here's a better example. Maybe this might be a little bit more relatable to people. Can you imagine if you go to a comedy club, let's say, and there's a stand-up comic who's telling bad jokes? That would be bad enough in and of itself. But can you imagine if he was just doing them a bunch of bad jokes, none of which follows from the other, none of them make sense, and he's just kind of doing it in this kind of rapid-fire way, just without even letting you take a breath to let his jokes settle in, he moves on to the next one, which has nothing to do with what just happened. That's what I feel here. The analogy that I was going to say from professional wrestling was, if you just have a match where guys are just doing moves to each other and nobody's kind of selling the moves, you're just watching guys putting on like what's essentially like a gymnastics routine or something like that, and you're saying to yourself like what am I watching? That guy hit him and he didn't even flinch, and nothing makes sense. There's no continuity or anything like that. That's what I feel here. Just to kind of bring it to a close, when I think about episodes like this, where something kind of goes wrong in a way that the IMF doesn't expect. I try to think back and I say to myself, so what was the original plan here? What did Jim think Holman was going to do? Everything goes up to plan until Shannon gets abducted by the bad guys. Let's say that doesn't happen. Let's say that Shannon and whoever else needs to actually had some competence and didn't put themselves in a position to allow that to happen. What exactly did they think that Holman was going to do for the initiation ceremony that night? Did Jim think, oh, well, Holman will probably sacrifice Kellis? Did he think that Holman was going to confess to the others and say, well, I really kind of don't want to lose my soul, so let's never speak about this again? Was Jim going to get the others to turn on him? I don't know. I can't even imagine. What was the plan if, let's say that Holman doesn't react the way that he does? What if he welcomed him and say, oh, Satan, man, it's so awesome that you're here? Was Jim prepared for that? I don't think so, especially based on what happened in the previous episode where Jim was just freaking careless. I've already spoken endlessly about that in the previous review. I just don't get it. I'm gonna chalk this up to just somebody who had this idea for an episode and just said, oh, it would be so cool if we just do this. I don't know if cool is the adjective they use, whatever adjective they use. Let's do this, but just didn't give any thought as to how you could put it together in a cohesive and cogent story. I will definitely say that this is probably the worst script ever written for the show, including the original series. I don't ever want to talk about this episode again, other than potentially saying something about it when I, rank all of the revival episodes. Maybe I'll say a little bit about it, but I really don't ever want to talk about it again. Am I prepared at this point to say that this is going to be at the bottom of that list? I'm not quite prepared to do that yet because I'm thinking of maybe some things from the second season that might make me think about that a little bit. But even then, I will say that this is definitely the worst script, and that does include anything that we're going to see in season 2 as well. I don't even know how to talk about this episode in terms of any of the things that I normally do. The villains are lame schmucks. Unengaging is not even really a factor in this, for me anyway. I don't even think it qualifies at the level to be discussed, in terms of those things. I was thinking, what do I say as a callback to an original episode from this? I can't even think of one. I really don't know. I tried, but there's nothing like this. There really isn't. And I really don't want to talk about it anymore. I feel kind of exhausted going through all that. Anyway, I'll end it here. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for being patient with my rants. I was actually going to do more of a rant, but I said that wouldn't be good for anybody other than myself and maybe not even for me. But thank you for watching. Please like this review video for what it's worth. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please leave your comments about this episode and other episodes. If you can watch this episode and find something in it that I should look at and say, Hamer, you should look at this. This was actually kind of okay, or dare I say even good or a little bit redeeming. I'll listen to what you have to say. I really don't think that there's anything there, but I certainly am willing to listen to your comments if you think I'm off base on this. Thank you guys again, and I'll see you next time.